Greetings, everyone. I'm going to try to walk us through some of the interesting implications of the parallels between Jude and 2 Peter 2 as a way to facilitate a better conversation when we are together in our next class session. So what I have here on the right is 2 Peter 2 with all of 2 Peter visible. That's a note to myself, meaning basically we have all the words of 2 Peter because that's the passage we're interested in, not only the words that have parallels with Jude. Jude is not fully complete, but you'll understand some of the notes about what's included and omitted momentarily. I'll go briskly through things we've already translated just to draw your attention to a few things that might help make sense of what was bizarre in 2 Peter. It might make more sense if we see what its possible source was. So there were I'm going to translate 2 Peter 1:2. There were false prophets in the people, there'll be false teachers among you, who, par eis axousin, who will introduce, par eis ago, destructive heresies. You see here in Jude 4, when Jude introduces the trouble, tenes anthropoi, certain people have snuck in. They have par eis edousan. Not the same word, but we'll see enough things here to think this parallels aren't coincidental. 2 Peter 2 goes on to say, many will follow in their asalgeia, debauchery. Jude talks about these people turning the grace of the Lord into debauchery. And then 2 Peter 2 says, for whom, down here in the bottom, for whom the krima, the judgment, ekpali, from long ago. And notice Jude has the krima, and these people were written down pali, Finally, rather peculiar terminology for arneomai is not uncommon to deny, but to have despotes, which is not nearly as common as kurios in early Christian or early Jewish terminology. So they both have denying the despotes, some sort of connection. None of it makes 2 Peter that much clearer. We move on. Here I make a general note. Jude gives a tidy batch of 3 illustrations of bad behavior punished in the past. 2 Peter 2:4-9 does something rather different. First with Jude. Jude starts and says, God, Jesus, or the Lord, having saved a people, then destroyed the ones who didn't believe. That's a reference to the wilderness generation, which is a pretty common illustration of sin in ancient Judaism, ancient Christianity. Peter doesn't include that example, so there's an omit. Then Jude gives the angels who sinned, and then Sodom and Gomorrah. We get both of those in 2 Peter 4-9. What's really different with 2 Peter 4-9 is that 2 Peter is also going to give examples of God rescuing people, and then is going to draw a conclusion from that. But we'll note some parallels. Here you see they both, 2 Peter 2:4 says, if God did not spare the angelon who sinned, that's tidy. Notice that what is in green is parallel, what 2 Peter has described as sinning, Jude has described more colorfully and in detail as the angels who didn't keep their own arche, maybe rule or primacy or position, but left, abandoned, taught idion, oikterion, their own home, their home. So a lot more explication about what the angels did wrong. Whether 2 Peter didn't want to get into all that or didn't understand it or what, he just says the angels who sinned. We talked with 2 Peter that this word serais could also be serois, a masculine, meaning pits. So God handed them over, consigned them to Tartarus with pits of gloom. Jude has desmois, bonds. Lots and lots of passages describing the fall of the Watchers mention their bonds, their chains. So anyway, here's a weird way the parallels work. 2 Peter will either describe pits of gloom, gloomy pits, or bonds, chains of gloom. That word gloom shows up in Jude, but in some ways a more natural position. They are under gloom. That is, they have been kept in a dark, low, gloomy place. And maybe 2 Peter felt like he covered that with consigned them to Tartarus, Tartarao. In any event, in both cases, we get a christen and the verb tereo. Jude has God has kept them for the judgment of the great day. Here we have they are kept for judgment, about the same. Now, 2 Peter 2:5, God didn't spare, same verb as before, the ancient world. Jude doesn't have the example of the flood, which is interesting because that's a good example of a sinful generation, often used in sort of homiletic type contexts. And then 2 Peter talks about how God spared, protected Noah, the herald of righteousness. That's not in Jude. Next example of sinners, Sodom and Gomorrah. That's also not surprising. They're used already throughout the Old Testament as an example of some sort of sin. Of course, people disagree on what they did. Notice that, first, the easy part. 2 Peter calls them a hupodeigma, an example. Jude says they were put forth as an example. All right, they're both an example of some, in both cases, they're an example. Again, Jude is much more explicit about what he thinks went wrong. 2 Peter doesn't say what went wrong. Jude says Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, ton homoion tropon tutois, in the same manner as these. We have to go back to the same manner as what? As the same manner as the angels who didn't keep their own position. So according to Jude, the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is that just like the angels who left their proper domain to come mingle with human women, Sodom and Gomorrah were guilty of pornao, that's not surprising, specifically going after sarkos heteros, strange flesh. In other words, the angels sinned by mingling with humans, and the humans of Sodom and Gomorrah sinned by mingling with the quote-unquote flesh of angels. In other words, Jude thinks two examples of the same type of sin, just in different directions, transgressing a boundary. All right, 2 Peter has none of that. Moving along, Peter gives another example of rescuing. We had one with Noah, we have another with Lot. Nothing about that in Jude. And hence, because Peter's introduced two examples of rescuing, he can then conclude, kurios oiden, the Lord knows, the pious from temptation to rescue, knows how to rescue the pious from temptation, but the adikos, the unjust, how to keep them, terrain, koladzamenus, under punishment, for the day of judgment. All right, so obviously that's a whole different sort of motif. Peter then is going, just grammatically what happens, we're going to get parallels to the next verse in Jude, but with a sort of different syntax. So Peter has given us an accusative. The Lord knows how to terrain, to keep the unjust. 2 Peter now, let's just not even think about the parallel, is going to say more about the unjust. So we pick up with that accusative. Especially malistade, those who, after flesh, in defiled lust, porumenus. So we have those who go after, and those who kataphroneo, kriatitas, lordship, lordness, dominion. Hard to translate. What a strange abstract noun. Okay. So Peter's just going to say more about what bad folks these are and how then he changes to the nominative. They're daring and audacious, and they do not tremble when they slander doxas, glories. All right. Let's now look at our parallel in Jude. In Jude, this is a tight trio. So Jude 8, just note that I'm not making it up when I say there's a parallel of sorts. We're going to get flesh and flesh, where Jude says they defile, we're going to get miasmu, different vocabulary word, but similar idea of defilement. And we're going to get some sort of, no, it's just not that common to have this abstract noun, kuriates, lordship, kuriates. And then Jude is going to go right into, they slander glories. And that vocabulary is super uncommon. No one uses it. So there's obviously a connection. Let me quickly translate Jude 8. You'll see what a nice little trio Jude has and how 2 Peter sort of broken that up, if 2 Peter was using Jude. So Jude says, likewise, mentoi, moreover, kai hutoi, also these people, in their dreaming, when they dream, that's a strange participle. There's nothing about dreaming in 2 Peter. Note also that the Vulgate omits the word dreaming. Anyway, Jude then says, we have three finite verbs. They defile, they atheteo, they reject, and they blaspheme or slander. So the flesh, they defile. Lordship or authority, they reject. Glories, they blaspheme. And we already noticed that that tight trio is completely broken up. You'd never be aware from 2 Peter that underlying all this sort of mess was such a trio. Jude then introduces an illustration from some apocryphal story, the source of which was already sort of unclear in antiquity, to contrast their bad behavior with the good behavior of Michael and to sort of draw an illustration. So Jude says, Michael, the archangel, was arguing with the devil. What was he arguing about? The body of Moses. Well, needless to say, in 2 Peter, we just don't get any of that backstory. There's no Michael, there's no devil, there's no battle over the body of Moses, and we'll see there's no quotation of Zechariah 3:2. Quick translation of Jude. When Michael was arguing with the devil about the body of Moses, Michael the archangel did not dare, tolmao, to bring a christen of blasphemia, that is a judgment of blasphemy, which is slightly ambiguous, but rather Michael just said, epitemesai soi kurios, the Lord rebuke you. Now, that comes from Zechariah 3:2, which also involves a dispute, and the angel says, the Lord rebuke you, or the Lord says, the Lord rebuke you. It's not that important. Michael did something good. Michael didn't bring a judgment of blasphemy. Michael did say, the Lord rebuke you. Obviously, these clowns who are slandering glories are nothing like the Michael. If they're slandering glories, they certainly shouldn't be, because Michael, who's an archangel, didn't do any such thing. You can follow, even without knowing the story, you can tell what Jude's roughly trying to say to show just how bad their behavior was. Okay. 2 Peter. Michael the archangel becomes simply angels. And yes, they're greater, being greater in strength and power. They do not bring Pharaoh. That's the same verb as epiphero. A blasphemon christen. So now we just have the adjective, a blasphemous or a slanderous judgment. That sounds okay, but what's really confusing in 2 Peter is that because he's eliminated or never knew the backstory, a bit of narrative, like why was Michael fighting with the devil? What potential was there to bring a verdict of slander or a slanderous verdict? What potential was there from which Michael refrained? All you have is, in 2 Peter, just this kind of vague statement. The angels don't bring a blasphemous judgment before the Lord, from the Lord, in the presence of the Lord, something like that, probably from the Lord, against them. Who's the them? We've discussed the possibilities, but let me just say this. Let's imagine that in the story Jude 9 alludes to, it's clear why Michael might have brought a judgment, why the devil deserved it, why Michael refrained from doing so and instead said, "The Lord rebuke you." It's clear who might have brought a slanderous judgment against whom. Because 2 Peter has eliminated any references to the story, we're just left with this really vague "against them," which is going to mean what? Either the bad human beings, all right, good for the angels, not bringing a slanderous judgment, but why would the angels ever bring... Anyway, you can just see it. No, it doesn't really make sense. Maybe the angels don't bring against themselves, don't bring against each other, but that verse is kind of hurting. Okay, we're going to move on. Again, Jude is going to have kind of a nice sequence. So Jude 2:10. Jude, let me just show you real quickly. Okay. So we go from these people do slander glories. Michael didn't bring a judgment of slander. And then the bad people, these people, they do blasphemeo. They blasphemeo things they don't know. That which they don't know, they slander. And that which, notice Jude's nice little hasamen, hasadeh, that which they epistantai, that which they do know, but they know physikos, naturally or instinctively, the same way that allogatzoa know, that is, animals without logos, so just brute beasts. That which they know in this merely animal way, by those things, which they know carnally, they are destroyed. So I was trying to unpack the grammar of Jude because it's not the easiest thing for everyone. Jude just says these people, there's a lot of stuff they don't know. There's stuff they don't know and they slander it. There's stuff they do know in a merely natural way, just like animals do. And by that stuff, they're destroyed. Okay, nice and tidy. Let's come to 2 Peter. First of all, note the strength of the parallels. Hu toide. If you want to go one further, look at everything I have in pink here. I'm going to say it out loud. Hu toide hos a. Now read the first sounds of Jude 2:10. Hu toide hos a. We have the exact same string of sounds all the way through the beginning of a new word in 2 Peter. Probably a coincidence, although I don't know. It's a little confusing. At any rate, in any event, more parallels first, and then let's unpack 2 Peter. Allogatzoa. Okay, we're going to talk about irrational animals. We're going to talk about some sort of phusik, some sort of naturally. We're going to talk about corruption, thora, tharesontai. Those are all from the same verb as thero. So there's going to be destruction. We're going to talk about ignorance, agnoa. Notice that in blue we have Jude says there are some things they don't know. We're going to talk about blasphemeo. And we're going to describe this destruction as being N, which is usually, well, in Jude it's clear. In these things, I guess it's not totally clear. They're just corrupted by them, probably by the things they know carnally, or among them maybe. Anyway. Okay. So in a passage dense with parallels, Jude's very clear binary thing. What they don't know, they slander. What they know naturally, they're destroyed by that. To Peter, but these people are like unrational animals in that they are gegenaod, they are begotten, irrational animals are begotten naturally. Ace halosin kaiphthoron for capture. That's just a good hunting term. And destruction, i.e. you hunt and kill animals. But I think he may have busted up his little metaphor by introducing capture and destruction, because that's a different idea of destruction. They're like irrational animals. Okay. Then the grammar is going to get kind of hard. Okay, we're still going to have they slander, slandering in matters that they are ignorant about, in which things that they don't know, slandering in things they don't know about. I think that's how to render this line. So blasphemuntes would just agree with, I'll just quickly color these, with just the hutoi. These people are slandering things they don't know about. But this is kind of awkward. And furthermore, when you get from agnoeo, when you do happen to end up with the form that it would also be the dative plural participle, which I don't think will give us any satisfactory grammatical sense. All right, they're slandering stuff, so I'm throwing up my hands. They're slandering things they don't really know about. And in the phthora of them, they will be pharaohed. So they will be corrupted in their corruption. But what does that mean? There's various possibilities, but maybe just like the irrational animals are destined by nature, physikos, for phthora, so these people, just slandering stuff they don't understand, will be destroyed in the same destruction as irrational animals. Like they'll be destroyed, they'll perish when the animals perish. They'll be destroyed by their, I don't know. There's a few possibilities we can talk about more. You can see how, in some ways, it looks like the confusing sentence we have in 2 Peter 2:12 looks like it came from the very clear sentence in Jude 10. All right. Next verse. I skipped Jude 11. We're gonna come back to that in a moment. So that's worth noting. Jude 11 is going to come up later. Okay, we'll just move on. So 2 Peter now, let's start with 2 Peter. So we have plural. These people are slandering. And we're going to get more plural participles. They are adikeod, of the reward of unrighteousness. Do a little digging on the Greek here, because that doesn't really make sense. This looks like, to be the victim of injustice, to get non-dikeo justice. They are, but then how do you construe that with an accusative, misthon, and injustice? Probably those two go together, meaning something like unjust reward, unjust payment, right? The reward of injustice could be money made for something unjust, or it could be more metaphorical, like, oh, that's the reward for injustice, like getting whatever, your just desserts. That'll kind of make sense, but why would you put it with being wronged? So we'll talk about possible answers. More plural participles. They consider truphe in the day, luxury during the day, to be hedone, pleasure. So this is just sounds like good, rhetoric about luxuriation, which all stern ancient moralists find disreputable and the source of all sorts of evils. They consider daytime luxuriating to be pleasure. They are, now this is easy in 2 Peter, it's harder in Jude. They are spiloi, spots, and momoi, stains, blemishes, as they, and trufo, same as truphe, as they luxuriate in the apatais, the deceptions, possibly the riches. Those are two meanings for apate, but apate normally means deception. Auton, as they soon haokumenoi humin, as they feast with you. All right, sorry. So it's a long sentence. Let me just break it down real quick. So they're feasting with you. And they are, in fact, spots and stains. They're luxuriating. They're luxuriating in their deceptions when they feast with you. Just look at what we have in Jude. First of all, Jude says these people are in your humon instead of auton. And they're in your agapais. That plural for love can really only mean love feasts, agapes, that is, celebrations of the Lord's Supper. And that noun did quickly become a term for the meal. So Jude also talks about them feasting with you and feasting in your love feasts and doing so wrongly. How does Jude say they're doing it wrongly? Well, they're shepherding themselves, so that's a bad thing. And Jude calls them spilades. This is not a talk about Jude, so we'll just leave that aside. That's a hard word. It might mean spots, just like 2 Peter has, but that might be 2 Peter's guess. It might mean storm winds. It might mean something else. It's a rare word. All right. So apatais and agapais and apatais. Has 2 Peter changed your love feasts into their deceptions? Because I don't know. Is it just a scribal error? Those things do look a little alike, sound a little alike. Interested to hear your thoughts. We're going to get some stuff totally unique to 2 Peter now. So we've had all these nominative participles, right? They are luxuriating. They are feasting. We're just going to get more, just more stuff that's bad about them. Since my main point here is to focus on parallels, I'll go over this just quickly. They have eyes full of adulteress and restless for evil. They deleadzontes, they ensnare or entice unstable souls. They have a heart trained for greed or trained of greed. I underline greed because that is a leitmotif in 2 Peter that's absent in Jude. You saw it at the very beginning. They traffic in you for greed, for money, with fabricated words. Jude had nothing like that. They are children of a curse, accursed children. Okay, whoopsie. Okay, moving briskly. Take a quick break if you want, but just want to highlight the major things here. Jude went straight from his example. Anyway, let's just go to Jude 11. This is out of order now, but we're going to see an intense set of parallels. Where Jude simply says, woe to them because, and then Jude has a super tightly fitted trio. In the way of Cain, they went. In the deception of Balaam, they were poured out or just like wasted away. And in the antilogia, the resistance of Korah, they perished. You will notice that tight trio, all aorist verbs, dative, 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 a noun, followed by a bad guy, bad guy, bad guy. The only place Jude breaks that super tight structure is with misthu, the word for reward. So in the deception of Balaam, they were poured out for reward. Or maybe in the deception of the reward of Balaam. Anyway, we'll leave that aside. 2 Peter is going to pick up that misthos, that reward. In fact, 2 Peter already used it. They were deprived of the wages of unrighteousness. Of Jude's little trio, Cain, Balaam, Korah, all, real classic sinners. Nothing wrong with any of those. 2 Peter has no Cain, has no Korah, does have Balaam, and expands Balaam considerably. So let's just come to 2 Peter. Having left the Altheon Hadon, the straight way, they wandered. Just note the subtle ways the parallels play out. It was the wandering, the deception, the misguidedness of Balaam. They went in the way of Balaam. Now here we get way where Jude had it with Cain. And he teases out, 2 Peter teases out why they followed in the way of Balaam. They loved, this is about Balaam. Balaam loved the misthon adikias. Balaam loved the reward of unrighteousness. Now that's clear. That has to mean Balaam loved an unjust reward. There's the motive why Balaam went wrong. Okay? And that goes back to the story that Balaam, why did he agree to work with Balak? Well, he was looking for money. And there's old interpretive traditions that defend and give that explanation. One of the weirdest things 2 Peter adds is it gives either a nickname or a patronym or something to Balaam, one that is attested nowhere else in any language in anywhere. They followed in the way of Balaam to Bosor. So either Balaam, the son of Bosor, which is wrong, or Balaam, and imagine this just being a nickname, right? Like Balaam the Bosorite. I'll tell you more about, I've looked up every possible 3-letter root with a B and any sort of sibilant and a resh, trying to look for like what nickname there might be. There were nicknames for Balaam. He was called Balaam the Lame and Balaam the One-Eyed and other things, but none of them really go with Bosor. So maybe Balaam the Fleshly, Basar, maybe something else. We'll have to leave that aside. We can talk about it when we talk just about 2 Peter. And more about Balaam. So he's really expanded the Balaam story. He got an elengson, a rebuke for his paranomia, his madness, when a aphonon, that's nice, 2 Peter, well done. He's talked about alagoi animals. Now we have aphonoi animals that are mute, that can't speak. Well, his mute beast of burden did speak with a human voice, and with a human voice hindered the madness of the prophet. And just note, we have paranomia, madness, the prophote, the prophet, and the paraphrenia, the insanity. So the lawlessness of the insanity of the prophet, and we just get this good word for uttering. And we're going to get a little more, you see uttering to uttering. Maybe that's nothing. Okay, so 2 Peter's made much more of the Balaam example and dropped Cain and Korah. Moving along, another case where Jude has a super tidy order, which 2 Peter seems to have destroyed. Jude says they are, and I've broken Jude up here, so you have to look at Jude to see. Jude gives 4 images now. 2 Peter has just 1. So Jude says they are clouds without water, borne about by the winds. The real parallel there is in this line in 2 Peter. They are mists driven by the storm. I have to say, both of those lines, you could retrovert, except for the word waterless in Jude, and they would look real nice. Those would look like 2 Greek versions of an identical Hebrew or Aramaic forlaga. Because words for clouds or mists, they're similar words, you could have just translated them different. And driven by a lilaps in 2 Peter, and driven by the winds in Jude, and the 2 words for driven or carried about, that will retrovert real nicely into Hebrew, and it just looks like variant translations. Our word for waterless 2 Peter has earlier, and he has it with pagai, springs. They are springs or wells without water. All right, good enough. Blah, blah, blah. 2 Peter skips the rest of what Jude offers about these people. Jude concludes, just like 2 Peter, for such ones, for whom? The Zophos, we get that word again, of darkness. So the darkness of darkness, or the dark gloom, the gloomy darkness, whatever you want to say, has been kept. And just notice, if 2 Peter is using Jude, he has omitted unto eternity. And there are 3 separate times 2 Peter would have omitted some reference to eternal punishment. Is that intentional? Is 2 Peter of the view that the dead are punished, but they're not punished eternally? Maybe. All right, Jude then has more terrific stuff, more of his little fourfold image. And Jude then quotes in Jude 14 and 15, he quotes first Enoch, which basically just says the Lord's going to come and bring judgment. Sort of weird that Peter would omit all of that, especially since 2 Peter 3 is all about the Lord coming in judgment. And we saw that Jude was at pains, 2 Peter was already at pains to say, the Lord will bring judgment. Their judgment doesn't slumber, blah, blah, blah. Was he bothered by the quotation of Enoch? Maybe, but I don't know. There are not many Christians in the first couple centuries who were bothered by quoting Enoch. So 2 Peter would be the odd man out if he was just like, ooh, I don't want to quote an apocryphon. Who knows? Moving on. Jude then just has more, he just introduces all of his polemic with, these are also more bad stuff. They're grumblers. They're more grumblers who are going according to their own desires, porumenoi, according to their own lusts. They speak huperonka, swollen things. And from 2 Peter, we just get that they utter swollen things. What kind of swollen things? Swollen things of vanity. So just swollen nonsense, bombastic nonsense. Peter again says they ensnare. It's the second time we've had that verb. Jude never speaks, anyway. They are ensnaring with lusts of the flesh, and then aselgeis, just kind of hanging. They are ensnaring someone. Jude just has good guys and bad guys, and talks mostly about the bad guys. 2 Peter has good guys and bad guys, but also talks about the effect the bad guys are having on others. So the fact that twice he's used this verb to ensnare or entice, he's going to say more about then kind of the victims. So if you will, a third category, not the in crowd who's on, safe, but a crowd in the middle who might be susceptible to the false promises of these bad guys. So they are ensnaring. Whom are they ensnaring? An accusative here. Those who, oligos, just barely, apophalgontos, just barely escaped. Whom did they just barely escape? The ones in deception, anastraphomenus, those conducting themselves or living in deception. All right. Now, notice something with no parallel whatsoever. We get the content of the false teachers. That's kind of cool. They are epangelaminoi. They're promising to the people who are getting tricked. They're promising to the people who've just escaped. They're promising them freedom when in fact they're slaves of corruption. I'm not going to go through this 2 Peter stuff as much because there's just no parallel. And the main point of this was to talk about the parallel. So it would be, they've just escaped the defilements of the world, blah, blah, blah. They get ensnared again. And then 2 Peter concludes, I'll just bring us to the end of here's the end of a chapter. Kratongar, it were better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than having known it to have turned back from. So having turned back from, and we get a nice long genitive construction, the having been handed over, paradidomi in the aorist passive, the commandment handed over to them. What kind of commandment? The holy commandment. Better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than having known it to have turned back from the way of righteousness which was handed over to them. The holy commandment handed over to them. Just notice that from an entirely different context in Jude, we have what looks to me like too much to be coincidental. but I'd be open to hear dissent. Where Jude says to his addressees, he urges them to fight for the having been handed over pistis. So you notice green for green, the faith, the commandment. Both of those words, we're used to pistis meaning belief, but faith can mean, the word pistis can mean in the ancient world already like contents of belief, like kind of like doctrine, the way we might say like, oh, I'm not familiar with the such and such faith. And you might just mean the religion, their beliefs. Anyway, if that's the meaning of pistis, that's pretty close to entole. You might just say, anyway. Notice that Jude also has a word for holy, right where 2 Peter has a word for holy, but with different grammar, which makes all the difference in the world. Jude has said, the pistis, which was handed over to the holy ones, that is, you, my readers, you saints, the same way Paul describes his readers as the saints, the holy. In 2 Peter, it's the people who might have turned back from the commandment given to them, the commandment which is holy. But how do you explain, by source critical terms, how 2 Peter would have sort of held in reserve until this latter part of his chapter one of the opening phrases from Jude, and then like lopped it on at the end? That seems weird, doesn't it? To me, it seems too much in common to be a coincidence, but it's a rather different usage of Jude than something we've seen throughout, where you sort of get same content in the same order. Now let's talk about being daring. Now let's talk about daring. Now let's talk about blasphemy. Now let's talk about blasphemy, etc., etc. This is very different. I don't know what to make of it. All right. And finally then, 2 Peter just ends with a quotation from another text. It has happened to them, the true proverb, like a dog returns to its own vomit, like a sow having been washed to wallowing in the mire. Nothing like that in Jude, nor would we expect there to be, because 2 Peter has already said, I'm quoting, this is the case of a paroimia, a proverb. So there you have it. In some cases, the parallels help us make sense of things. In some cases, we can see that 2 Peter is much more complicated and has maybe made a hash of his grammar because he was trying to use Jude. But in other cases, it's hard to say he's just using Jude. And if you wanted to say that Balaam loved the reward of unrighteousness, that makes sense to me. But why say earlier these bad people are sort of adikeod of the reward of unrighteousness? Why introduce that earlier? And if you're going to do so, why not just say they love? Just use the same verb you use with Balaam, or I don't know. Why introduce it then? So many questions. At times, it feels like the parallels are better explained by imagining some intermediate Greek stage. A lot of the mistakes or the differences seem to be dependent at the Greek stage. Spill and spill, agap and agap, the apat, those look and sound alike. They don't mean anything alike. So we have, a certain type of change. In other cases, Tharesantai doesn't look or sound at all like Therontai. So give us some thought. We'll talk more about the details, but I just wanted to walk you through some of the big things and also give you a quick translation for some of the hard stuff in Jude, which you might not have been inclined to look at, and to see how that could make sense of what's baffling in 2 Peter.